Well, there was so much to share, and I want to just today kind of coming back, having been gone and having gone through so many different experiences of things I saw, things I heard, things I felt. I wanted to share maybe 3 spiritual moments from my time in Europe. And as I was sitting here, I realized, there was one that was so important. Kind of didn't fit my organization, but I'll share it with you anyway today. So, I was in 3 countries, Germany, Spain, and Turkey. I basically was in 3 cities with a little bit of Barcelona as the 4th. I was in Berlin, I was in Cordoba, Spain, and I was in Istanbul, Turkey. I spent a lot of time in houses of worship, and that's kind of what I want to focus on, the spiritual tradition part this morning. So the first thing I would say to you is when you are traveling, what do you see a lot of beside famous sites? If you are traveling in Europe, you see a lot of other people traveling. Cheryl is nodding her head. You see a lot of tourists. You probably could spend your whole time watching tourists, but that's not why you're there. Right? But my heart was touched by something I noticed with tourists this time, which I had never thought of before. In many of the buildings of worship that I was in, whether Christian or Muslim, they have a basilica form, which means they have a dome. And so what do people do? What do you notice people do? This. So much looking up, so much looking up. In several places in particular. And this morning as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, remember the psalm, I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. And there is this understanding somehow, we know that God is not up. And yet part of the reason that we look up in worship and various things to God is it has to do with how we are neurologically set up. What we experience when we look up as opposed to what we experience when we look down. So I saw many of these tourists moving through these buildings, and one day, I think I was in Barcelona in the Sagrada Familia, which is so colorful inside, probably the most colorful church inside, and I saw everybody walking in. Of course, and people walk into these huge churches or mosques, and they're struck with awe, right? There's this huge space that they've entered, and then they're looking up. And I was struck by these people as seekers. They may not have been there explicitly or declaredly because they were looking for the presence of God or the record of God or the history of how God has been revealed. But I was convinced that in many cases, if not all, that's why their souls were there. On some level, through the beauty, through the history, through the pictures, through the calligraphy, they wanted to know that God is real. So, thinking of the things that touched me in addition to seeing these tourists as perhaps even fellow pilgrims, were sights and sounds. And the first one I want to share is the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. Now, down the line, I'll be doing PowerPoints, and you'll get to see. I took 1,100 pictures, but who's counting? I'll tell you, the iPhone worked. I was wearing these cargo pants or something they're called. I've owned them for years, but last time I went to Europe, I didn't wear them. I had my passport over here for at least the first half of the trip before I started leaving it back and I had my iPhone over here. So I didn't have to wear a fanny pack, which is just a pain. I didn't have to wear this thing hanging down. It was right there. And as I told, every week or two, I washed them, as I told people. But those pants, they were absolutely fantastic. So, the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba was the second time I had been there, and as some of you know, I was determined to get there at least on one Sunday so that I could go to Mass. The story of the mosque cathedral in Cordoba is that the building was actually begun in the 800s or shortly before the 800s. It still exists. It was created as a mosque, to some extent patterned after the Grand Mosque of Damascus, and is filled with double horseshoe arches, alternating brick and white. And this kind of makes you think a little bit of barbershop poles in this country. And that's a design you see other places as well. Once the Christians retook Cordoba in 1236, the building became a Christian house of worship. And now it is officially a cathedral, and Muslims cannot worship there as Muslims. It is a Christian house of worship. Anyone, of course, can visit it. It's also, to some extent, a museum. But there is a cathedral. The cathedral was added in the 1500s. Now, as soon as the Christians became the leaders in Cordoba, they consecrated the mosque as a place of worship in 1236. But they just set apart for a chapel. And it was not until the 1500s when it became, when there was a cathedral. When I was there in 08, I was not impressed with the cathedral. It just seemed to me that it didn't fit. And there is a legend, which may not be true, but it is an important legend about the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba, that in the 1500s, when Charles V, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, came to visit that mosque, and by the way, the legends are conflicting as to whether he was in favor of putting a cathedral in it or not. I've heard both opinions. But when he came to visit, he is reported to have said, when he first saw the new cathedral, "You have taken something unique in all the world and created something ordinary." Because approximately 20% or 15% of the mosque was now carved up and designated to a cathedral, which is kind of in the middle of the mosque. So I had been there since the middle of the week, and so on Sunday I found out the time of worship. There's only one worship, I had to chuckle, at 10 o'clock, I think, in the cathedral. There are other chapels around where you can worship at other times, but on Sunday, just one worship. And I don't know how much, maybe 300 people. It is a small cathedral, as cathedrals go. You feel the space of it, but when you look around at the seats, there are not a whole lot of seats. I would say probably not more than 300 people, but they were full. The mosque, the cathedral is very ornate, in a Gothic kind of cathedral, and as Christians, Muslims, and other faiths tend to do, part of the commitment when the Christians created the cathedral was to make sure that the dome of the cathedral was what? Higher than any other place in the building. So the highest point in the building is the dome of the cathedral. So the worship, of course, was in Spanish and Latin, and I didn't understand most of the words, even though the sacrament, of course, is very common, because we do our sacramental thing is modeled on the Mass, the sacrament of the Mass. So the part that was most moving for me, and I brought this, had to do with how we can perceive the reality of God or the mystery behind the dogma of whatever faith we happen to be. In this case, I'm worshiping in a Roman Catholic place. Now, many of you know that as United Methodists, when we celebrate communion, we do not hold the bread and either wine or grape juice to be the actual body and blood of Jesus Christ, okay? Most Protestants don't. Lutherans have some middle-of-the-road thing. I don't get it. I didn't understand it when I was a Lutheran. I don't understand it now. But in the Roman Catholic, but we understand it to be symbolic, and symbolic does not mean unimportant. Can I have an amen? But in the Roman Catholic tradition, there is the moment, and you see it jumps me up. It's very powerful in all this ornate thing, at which the priest, the officiating priest, raises it and looks at it and holds it. And those of you who are former Catholics or who've attended Mass understand. It was a very powerful moment for me. And in that moment, I sensed the human desire to encounter God in worship. Behind the particular words that does this become the body, behind that, the mystery of God That's the faithfulness of that gesture, that somehow when you lift it, you expect something to happen. It is mysterious, and it is also, I don't want to say simple, but it's beautiful. And then as a pastor, I also wondered what the priest was going through. Because some of you have talked to clergy. Some clergy will say, I can never worship at a service at which I'm leading worship. Not really. Not really. I can really worship when I go somewhere and I don't have any responsibilities. And then there's the other piece that happens when you worship, if you're clergy and you're doing it all the time. Things get routinized. And I cannot honestly say that every time I do communion it's as powerful as every other time. You know, it does. But I just in that kind of moment, as the bishop actually was present, because it's a cathedral, as he was elevating the host, I thought, I wonder what the experience is for you. Are you encountering God in that moment? So I pretended to be Roman Catholic, and I partook. So it was very precious. But that got me thinking about gesture and movement. And we in the Protestant tradition don't do a lot of it, do we? In the Reformed tradition, those folks who come out of John Calvin and other part of the Reformed tradition, as opposed to our Wesleyan tradition, often the communion happens by passing it down the row, right? I worked at a Disciples of Christ church, and we had communion that way. Now, please hear me. I am not criticizing that mode of doing it at all. That's the way Presbyterians do it, right? And you can certainly make a strong theological basis for that. It is serving one another. It is being ministered. So I'm not making any judgment on it. I'm just saying that for me, for some reason, maybe because I grew up in Lutheranism, which is a little more high church, and we came forward, it means so much to me at every communion, and we did it this way at the cathedral in Cordoba, to come forward to receive. Because when that happens, I often have, even though I focus on each person, but when I see people starting to move forward, and it happened there and in Berlin, for me it's symbolic. I have this sense of 2,000 years of Christian tradition, of people making the choice to do that, sometimes having it be a courageous choice. For us, it's not a courageous choice at all, but the richness of that. So once again, the movement of it. So I was blessed to come forward and to receive the wafer. And in that time, I experienced what I experienced many times, I guess, including the tourist thing I just mentioned, and now this thing at Mass. The longing of human beings to somehow experience God. However that may be, and on every Sunday it may differ. Some of us tend to get it through our ears. Some of us tend to get it through our eyes. Some of us tend to get it through here. But that desire to have that experience, and there I was reflecting on it in the context of the sacrament. Istanbul. So many basilicas. And I had jokingly, but not totally jokingly, said to a few folks before I left, I wish our Christian tradition had more roundedness in it. More roundedness. The Gothic cathedrals is so vertical, right? Our cross is right angle, something of a harsh symbol, commemorating a harsh event, right? Well, let me tell you, I got rounded out when because the churches, the basilica, which was inherited from the Romans, is all over there, not only in Muslim mosques, but in churches as well. Hagia Sophia, for example, was built in the 500s by the Emperor Justinian, and was built as a church, and then by 1300, I think, became a mosque, and now Hagia Sophia is not a worshiping space now it is a museum. If it were not a museum, you probably wouldn't still have all the beautiful mosaics representing Jesus, Emperor Constantine, all these if it were a mosque, they would be gone. So praise God and praise the Islamic powers that be that have allowed those representations still to be there. So you have the symbol of Allah and the names of the 4 first caliphs who followed Muhammad around, all kinds of Arabic. And in most mosques, the very center of the dome has some Arabic inscription. And if it isn't in the very center, it's Arabic right around whatever is the ornamentation in the center. So I probably visited about 10 mosques, I think. And I know when I look at some of my 1,100 pictures, I'm going to say about a couple of them, oh, which one was that? But I want to talk for a minute in the line here of gesture and movement about the common prayer posture of Islam. Now, I saw a number of women and men, but the women are always in a separate section in the back, praying. I did not go into a mosque at prayer time, and some of the mosques won't let you in while the people are praying. And the tourists, in most cases, there were a couple of exceptions, had to stay back behind a certain thing. But I would see scattered men praying, sometimes right after prayer time, so I thought perhaps they'd come late and they were now going through the process. But here I want to get some input from you here. I want to talk about this practice of prostration. And by the way, prostration is a part of the Christian tradition. Now, I don't know how many of you here have ever encountered it, but it's not as if we don't have it. And I think perhaps in Roman Catholicism it is still more present. But we don't do a lot. What do we do with prayer? We don't do much, mostly, except what? Our hands, right? But in our tradition, there have been many more options, many other ways of praying in addition. So, when someone prays by prostration, and of course in Islamic prayer, you're up and then you're down, and there's a thing of this and there's a thing of this, and then you're down. But a lot of the time you're down, and I suggest to you that posture of being all the way down is capturing the imagination of many people in the world. So I want to ask, it's a powerful, so what does it convey? What does that posture convey?
Submission.
Yeah, that's the primary word. Yeah, you can't get any deeper bow to God, can you, than getting yourself flat on the floor. And in Christian practice, there's also the total one being totally lying down. It is submission. Now, is submission a value in the Christian tradition? Absolutely. Perhaps not as stressed as it is in Islam. Things are differently held, but certainly submission. When we talk about how do I do the will of God, how do I put God before the things that I want to do? But we tend not to show submission in our bodies or to have practices that allow us to have our body be where our words are. So I come back with a lot of questions about that. I stayed in a guest house after my 6-day Rick Steves tour. By the way, Rick Steves, that was a great tour. And in this guest house, the woman who was doing it, her husband is Muslim and Sufi, but she is Russian Orthodox Christian. And she told me, even though we didn't have time to talk much about it, that there is more movement of prayer and various postures and movement postures in the Orthodox tradition than there is in our Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So the other thing about the ears. One day when we were with the Rick Steves tour, our guide took us up to the top of an old largely unoccupied han. Han being a place where there are businesses on the ground floor, and upstairs they're working. They're doing silversmith, they're doing gold, they're doing whatever they're doing. This building was largely unoccupied. We found 2 places where people came out and talked to her. Her name was Mine, our guide. She was great, and they obviously knew her. She had permission. Someone had to let us into this building. We got up to the top of this old, quite dilapidated building. And we didn't know why she was taking us up there. It was about 4 o'clock. Oh, it was Pretty amazing. First, we started to hear a voice coming from very far of the muezzin, the men who call the people to prayer. And then we heard another voice from over here. Then we heard another voice closer from here. Then we heard another voice really up close from here. Now, there's a mosque in practically every neighborhood in Istanbul. I can't tell you how many we heard. And there is apparently some kind of etiquette about not covering over one another. And yet you have to keep to the time, right? You can't wait until person A has finished before you start. And so I put some of it on my cell phone, and one of the men in the tour had a better reception of it, and he had sent it to us as a PDF already. But we were so grateful to Mine for giving us this experience. I can't even think of an adjective to use, but it was very powerful to hear that auditory reminder that to remember God. If you look behind the "it's time to pray," look behind that doctrine, and what is it? It's a way to make God real again. To remember God, to be in relationship with God, to hear God's guidance. So, much more I could say, but I want to share a question that I carry away from all of this. And I asked Mine, and she gave me an answer, and it didn't seem to me to be an answer. And perhaps I haven't formulated the question yet in the best way. But one of the ways we tell the story of our faith is through representation of people. Saints, in Berlin, there was Martin Luther up there, and Zwingli, and Calvin, and Melanchthon. You see the representation in a painting or however it is, a fresco, mosaic, and you tell a story about them. You tell it to your children, you tell it. Is there a Christian sanctuary that doesn't have some representation of Jesus? Probably not. Right? And that is telling the story about the end of Jesus' life. The crucifix in the Roman Catholic Church, we usually see an unoccupied cross in Protestantism, but the crucifix also is part of telling the story. So I asked Mine, all right, you never have representations of God, of Muhammad, of any of the people. How do you tell the story? Well, I didn't get a clear answer from her. But I think part of the answer has to do with practice. It has to do with that prayer time, that sound coming to you all the time. It has to do with putting your body into places, shaping your body in ways that remember this. But it still is a question that I have. How is it when Islam does not use representation of people at all, that the story is being told as powerfully as it is? So the calligraphy, of course, is really beautiful, but that's a whole lot of questions I have. So upcoming, on October 30th, Reformation Sunday, I will, by the grace of God, have a PowerPoint about my visit to Wittenberg, Lutherstadt, the Martin Luther's, place where Martin Luther, not his birthplace, but where he nailed the 95 Theses on the church in Wittenberg. And I think we'll kind of focus around "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" in the conversation we have. And then during the coming year, I'll be doing other things. One of the moving thing was a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. I really want to give time with that in some way, and I'm not sure where that will be. Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, a couple of the mosques in Istanbul. So what we will do with this will, to some extent, have to do with what your longings are or what your interests are. So please talk to me, call me up. If you say, gee, would you please do something about this particular house of worship, if it's one that I was at. If I can, I would try. And I don't know how this will be. It won't all be at worship. So in closing, I have written here, may God be with you as you move and gesture in deepening your sense of how you can be a part of God's story this week. In your gesture, in your reaching out to others, in your prayer gestures, in your movement, the choices you make, where you go and how you move there. May you sense yourself a part of God's story this week. Amen.